Running a business comes with a lot of what ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
The number one selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is David Grimm, a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America, which we'll be talking about today. David Grimm, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought we'd start with, well, the origins of Project 25. Can you talk a little, 2025. Can you talk a little bit about how it came about and who was most responsible for this?
I think we can think about it on a lot of different levels. I mean, in some ways, this is the continuation of work that the Heritage Foundation has been doing since the 1970s. And some of the intellectual strains here are even older than that. But this, in the specific sense, it started shortly after Trump left office. It started in early 2022. And the idea was that the Heritage Foundation wanted to convene a bunch of policy thinkers, kind of and politicians from across the MAGA right or the MAGA curious or MAGA open right, to put together a plan for the next Republican president. And they felt that when Trump had come into office the first time, he had been slow starting, and that throughout his presidency, he'd been handicapped by poor political appointees, by civil servants, by a lack of a plan. And they wanted to ensure that when Trump or the next Republican president entered office, that person would be prepared and be able to get a lot more done.
And as you pointed out, the Heritage Foundation has been doing this for a while, really since the early Reagan administration. And so is there anything that, in your view, makes Project 2025 distinctive in any way?
So I think there's a couple things. One is, the Republican Party has changed in that time, and so you see a different set of priorities. But I think what really sets this apart from a lot of the other kind of policy wish lists that you get think tanks putting out every 4 years is how carefully they thought about their methods of getting things done. So when this was talked about during the 2024 campaign, I felt like it was often discussed mostly in terms, and I was guilty of this too, in terms of the kinds of policies that were in there. But when you read it as an entire document, you see how much they've thought about how to use the government, how to change the way the executive branch works, the kind of precedents they wanted to overturn, and how they would use that to implement the vision of society they wanted. And in that way, I think it is, in some ways, not conservative. It is right-wing, but is less conservative in that it is much more open to a strong executive power, much more open to using a muscular form of government to achieve the kind of vision of society they like.
Yeah, it seemed to me that, because I've seen some of these in the past, and it seemed to me it felt like it was more focused on, I guess I'd say, structure and institutions than policies, which felt to me like more like what Heritage had been doing in the past on that. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
But I wonder, like I said, there have been a bunch of these, and they come and they go, and it seems like they quickly just fade into complete obscurity. All these detailed policy blueprints for the next administration. I mean, is there anything that makes you think that this is different than all of those countless policy blueprints that were thrown away before?
I was nervous about this at the, having written this book, I was nervous that they would not follow it at the start of the Trump administration. And I think there's a certain amount of, you can see the evidence in what they've done. And I think the reasons that it has stuck around more are partly the methods, the structure and institutional stuff. And I also think that they thought really carefully about staffing. One prong of Project 2025 was to identify and train and vet people who could staff the next administration, so they would have a better class of appointees than they'd had the first time around. I also think it helps that Trump is a little bit more of a policy blank slate. He cares a lot about tariffs. He cares a lot about immigration. Those are things he's been talking about since the 1980s. But there's a lot of areas where he has less fully foreign policy views or just isn't as interested. And so, I think they cleverly figured out how to graft themselves onto the MAGA movement, or how to find a symbiosis where Trump is getting what he wants and they're getting what they want. Those things are not always the same, but they overlap and they dovetail nicely.
At one point in the book, you write that many of the people behind Project 2025 are not, in fact, conservative, something you mentioned before, as well as that the project, in your view, is rooted in a conviction that there's no constitutional order left to save. I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit, especially that last bit.
Yeah. So, there's a kind of apocalyptic strain through some parts of the Trump aligned right. And the first place I remember really noticing this was in the Claremont Review of Books article, The Flight 93 Election, in the lead up to 2016, when a writer who was at the time anonymous but has now identified himself as Michael Anton and who's in the Trump administration talked about it, likening it to the plane that was crashed in Pennsylvania on 9/11 by passengers who, took over the plane from the hijackers. And he said, we have to take over that. We have to charge the cockpit. There's a lot of danger. Maybe Trump will be a disaster, but we have to act now. And you have that same sort of sense through a lot of the authors. They say things like, we're in the midst of a Marxist takeover of America. The left is not going to stop until it's over. And, we're very late in that. We have to act now. You've had Russell Vogt, who is kind of the intellectual architect of Project 2025, and now the head of the Office of Management and Budget, saying, don't tell me we're living in a constitutional order. The Constitution, we're past that now. And so I think once you both feel that the Constitution has already been discarded, as they do, and also when you feel like there's an existential threat, it opens up your willingness to try new methods and to try things that haven't been done before. It expands the playing field, if you will.
I wonder how much of that is just a convenient rationalization from the Project 2025 authors. Because if you say, well, there's no constitutional order left to save, then we can do whatever the hell we want, essentially. And so I guess, and it's kind of difficult to get into motives, but do you have a sense that these folks truly believe this, or is just this kind of a convenient way to engage in some pretty radical right-wing reordering of American politics?
We're dealing with politics, so I will not write off cynicism as a possible factor. I do think that there's a sincere thing going on here, and you see this through a lot of people, a lot of Trump voters and a lot of Trump supporters in the media. You'll get the same kind of apocalyptic rhetoric. I also think it comes a little bit naturally to stretch at parts of the sort of Christian nationalist right or the, evangelical right, where there's an identification with the early church and persecution. You have, a lot of polling that shows a sense of persecution among right-wing Christians. And so I think they do feel this. Vogt is an interesting case because he is somebody who has, a pedigree from both a religious pedigree and a fiscal conservative pedigree. Not obviously a Trump person, but when you listen to his rhetoric and you talk about the sorts of things he said about the 2020 election being stolen or about Trump's prosecutions, if he doesn't mean it, he is very convincing in the way that he voices his objections. It sounds sincere to me.
What about Donald Trump's connection to all this? Because he had said, this is prior to the 2024 elections, yeah, I've heard of this thing, but I don't have anything to do with it. There are some good ideas in it. There are some bad ideas, I'm told, but it's not my thing. So how much distance would you say there actually is between Donald Trump and Project 2025?
I think it's a little bit of a nuanced question because, there are things that Trump cares about that Project 2025 does not. And there are things that the authors care about a lot that Trump doesn't. And there's places where they have disagreements. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I also think that distance was kind of nonsense. Like there are about 70 people who contributed to the document. And roughly a quarter of them worked in the first Trump administration. Several of them were cabinet officials. Many of them are in the current Trump administration. Russell Vought was Trump's OMB head in the first term. He, was the intellectual architect here. He worked on he was the leader of Trump's policy committee for the Republican National Convention, and now he's back in the administration as head of OMB again. So you see this idea that personnel is policy being played out not only in the report but also in the way Trump has staffed things. I'm willing to believe that Trump hadn't read it. But I think Trump understood that there was going to be a lot of connection between what was in this idea and what was in this document and what he was going to do, and we've seen that.
I want to follow up on that personnel is policy thing because I think that is so very important. And to me, that's, as I mentioned before, that's one of the things that sort of struck me about Project 2025 is that focus on institutions, and so and the people who are running those or staffing those institutions. Can you talk a little bit more about how kind of in broad strokes, Project 2025 envisions changing personnel policies and staffing in the federal government and how important that is to sort of the overall framework of this project?
Yeah. So there's kind of two big tracks. One of them is the civil service. And, the civil service as currently constituted, it dates back to the late 19th century, although it has transformed and gotten a lot larger. And there's a real frustration among a lot of people on the right with civil servants in the federal government. They felt we've heard Trump obviously talk about the so-called deep state, but you've had complaints that go back much longer than that. And there's a sense that civil servants are too liberal. And it's true, like polling suggests they are more likely to vote Democratic. And that they were sort of out to slow down the first Trump administration. Sometimes because of an ideological motivation, maybe just because they were lazy and they didn't, they were used to doing things one way and they didn't want to change the way it was working. In some cases, they see themselves as the guardians of procedure and of law, and Trump was trying to do things and change the way things worked in ways they felt were improper. So there's a lot of places where there's conflict between Trump and the civil service. And so there's a bunch of ways they seek to change that. One is they simply want to reduce the number of positions that are out there. So obviously we've seen since January 20th, Elon Musk and Doge just laying federal workers off left and right, as well as other parts of the government doing this, using various methods, whether that's reductions in force or targeted firings, all kinds of things. They want to shrink the bureaucracy. They also want to transform some bureaucratic positions into political appointments. So people may have heard about something called Schedule F, late in the first Trump administration, which was this order to convert about 50,000 positions from civil service to political appointments, where people serve at the will of the president. That was stopped as soon as Joe Biden took office, but Trump has now re-implemented it, and they're moving along on that line. So all of these things make the civil servants a little bit either smaller or less powerful, or potentially scared. So, Russell Vought talks about the idea that he wants to put the civil servants in trauma. He wants them to be traumatized. Use some as an example, and the other ones will fall in line because they'll want to keep their job. That's a big thing. And that's something that I had heard a lot about before embarking on this. The other thing that surprised me was the vitriol towards political appointees in the first Trump administration. That some of these people show and have expressed. They felt that when they got in at the beginning of Trump's first term, Trump was very slow to staff the federal government. I mean, for various reasons. One was that he didn't really seem to expect to win. Insofar as he had a transition plan, he delegated it to Chris Christie, but then Chris Christie was deposed in an internecine fight with Jared Kushner promptly, and all of that was thrown out. So he was further behind. And then there were a lot of people who didn't want to work in the Trump administration for ideological or personal reasons. And so that left him with a lot of people who were not necessarily the caliber of worker that other administrations have gotten. The people who did come in were, maybe they were not as good. Maybe they were hangers-on from the George W. Bush administration who weren't on board with the Trump agenda, or maybe they saw themselves as saving the country and the government from Trump, all these possible things. And so these folks were really upset about the way political appointees they thought simply didn't move Trump's agenda along. And for Paul Dans, who was the sort of organizer of Project 2025, I think this is very personal. He had not worked in government. He's a trained lawyer. And at the start of the first Trump administration, he had this idea that he was going to get a plum job at the Justice Department. And instead, it took him years to get to the White House. And he felt like he was being blocked by these people who were rhinos, who were not really MAGA. And so they wanted to make sure they had much better appointments and better appointees so that Trump could get more done.
And a big part of this is what's called the unitary executive, really pushing this to limits we've never seen, at least probably since the Civil War, certainly. This idea that the president should have full and complete control over everything in the executive branch, as opposed to, as the right would put it, letting these unelected career deep state bureaucrats have any kind of policymaking authority. And so I think a lot of folks would hear this from the right and think, well, yeah, he won. Elections have consequences. It's his executive branch. Why shouldn't he be allowed to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve or make people in policy positions all be accountable directly to him, as opposed to him not being able to fire them? What do you say to folks, especially on the right, who have this sort of view of executive power as it's, I think, shown in Project 2025?
I think it's an intellectually coherent position. And it makes sense when people make some of these arguments. I think you get complaints about bureaucrats being slow from, political officials in administrations of both parties. The public doesn't particularly love bureaucrats, and there are reasons for that. I think that there's a couple places where it's not so much a theoretical problem, but a practical problem. One is most of what most bureaucrats do is not political. The one we hear about cases where that's the case, but many times what they're doing is basically, clerical administrative. And related to that, if you replace people who are chosen on the basis of merit, and again, like the merit system has a lot of critics, maybe the merit system needs reform. But if you choose people who are selected not on merit, but on political loyalty, you're unlikely to get a better level of services. So the question is, do we want to sacrifice a sort of effectiveness of government and efficacy of services for this theoretical point about, unitary control? I also think it gets messy when you look at the independent regulatory agencies. So one of the big concerns they have is they feel like things like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, you name it, all of these federal independent agencies are a constitutional abomination. They look at these and they're like, there's no, it's outrageous that they live within the executive branch, and yet the president can't direct them what to do. And that's a structure that goes back to 1935. There's a case called Humphrey's Executor where Franklin Roosevelt tried to fire commissioners, and the Supreme Court shut him down and said, this is the way the structure works. So for 90 years, we've had the Congress passing laws that assume that these agencies have this independence. If you give if you were to overturn all those laws and give control of all those agencies to the president, it's going to really radically reshift the way government works. And I think that's it's hard to imagine how that plays out, and it's very unpredictable. So that's very much not a small C conservative thing. I think it would really change the entire shape of the executive branch.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
I'm Cindy Lauper with fellow Cosentix advocate, Chef Michelle Bernstein.
We'll share our experiences with plaque psoriasis, with psoriatic arthritis, and Dr. Panico will talk about the possible connection.
Cosentix secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentix. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some are fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur.
Learn more at 1-844-COSENTIX or Cosentix.com/Cindy.
Yeah, well, you mentioned, you've used the word outrage and similar words a number of times. And it seems to me that one of the, I guess, disadvantages of so many of us being in our ideological bubbles is we don't appreciate the outrage or don't even understand the outrage coming from the other side. Because when I'm a person of the center left, and certainly people on the left have seen Project 2025 from the beginning as sort of this assault on American democracy, assault on American values. But if you talk to folks on the right, and I've talked to plenty of them, they say, well, no, actually, the real assault came on the left. The left's been in charge of our educational, our cultural, our political institutions, and they've radically restructured them for generations. So what they see, what we see as an attack, I think many of them see as sort of a restoration of real American values. And what do you think about that? Because I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right about that view. And, when you look at Project 2025, you see frustration with the civil service, which dates back to the 1880s. You see frustration with New Deal agencies from the 30s. You see frustration with with Humphrey's executor from 1935. You see frustration with Great Society programs. You see frustration with the creation and growth of the education department, and I think that's exactly right. They see many of these things as either bad for society or not subject to the Constitution, and they do want to restore a previous vision. I think that the structure we have has been built not just by Democrats; it's been built by Democrats and Republicans. Republicans have passed laws and established federal agencies as well. But what we see from the folks involved in Project 2025 and people aligned with them is a sense that these things need to be swept away because they are not working and they were improper in the first place.
There's a world in which, though, this actually might benefit Democrats, at least potentially. I can see this, an argument being that, well, if a lot of this stuff goes through and changes policy for a much stronger executive, well, sure, we have to deal with 3+ more years of Donald Trump. But if, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg is elected, well, he can maybe declare a climate emergency and do all kinds of stuff. Or, we can use executive power for what we consider to be our good causes as opposed to their good causes, which obviously are bad causes because we don't like them. I mean, what do you think about that reasoning? Hey, a vigorous executive that can work for us too.
Yeah, I think that's right. You want to see what that looks like in practice. I think that intellectually they would say that is true. The president should have control of the executive branch, and that means whoever the president is should have control. They couch this as a question of small d democratic principles. You don't want to have these unelected people. Now, in practice, obviously partisans tend to sing a different tune when they're in power than when they're not. But I think there's something to that. And, this is a place where I think rapid changes to government are really destabilizing. And so it's a little bit scary to me to imagine a situation where every 4 or 8 years you have a vast shift in the way the government works and the way people interact with the government. That seems troubling. I also think there are parts of the federal government that are hard to run that way. Some things you can do that very easily, but if you look at, say, scientific research, it's very hard to shift scientific research on such a quick basis, or it's hard for, universities to respond to a rapidly changing funding regime. And so that's the places where even if there's an intellectual case for it, I wonder what that would actually look like in practice.
So in a sense, this is a good thing for radicals on both sides, but a bad thing for conservatives in the sort of traditional sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Edmund Burke would not like Project 2025.
Exactly, yeah. You mentioned earlier, Christian nationalism, and that comes up in the book a number of times. And so maybe we could start with you explaining what you take Christian nationalism to be and the role that you see it playing in Project 2025, including your concerns about it.
Oh man, I hate this question. It's tricky. And in my writing, I have tried to avoid talking about Christian nationalism because I think it means so many different things to so many people. And I think for a lot of people on the left, it becomes a catch-all. Like, here is somebody who I don't like, who is both conservative and religious. And I don't quite know how to define it because so many people mean different things. I was struck in working on this book by the way that they sort of own this term. So in an interview with Charlie Kirk, the conservative podcaster and sort of presence, Russell Vogt said, the left uses a lot of these pejoratives, but to me, Christian nationalist is not a pejorative. Like, I am a Christian and I am a nationalist. So Christian nationism is what I think I believe. And you hear them talking about the idea that, the United States was founded on religious principles, on Christian principles. It should be grounded in those principles. And then they want those principles to sort of govern what the nation looks like. And so that means, for example, pushing very, what they say is a biblically based formulation of the family. They want to see more religion in schools. They want to see the government sometimes operating according to religious principles. So to the extent they are Christian nationalists, I think that's what they mean by that. And that's how I understand it in the context of the book.
And in the foreword to the Mandate for Leadership, which I guess is the technical name for the Project 2025 document. And I'll admit, I did not read the whole thing, but I did read the foreword.
It's a lot. This is why I wrote the book, is so that people don't have to plow through all 900 pages. Because it's tough if you're not a specialist. There's a lot of dry language, and some of the pieces are better written than others.
For that alone, the fact you did this, you deserve some sort of praise. I don't know. But so I did read the foreword. And in that foreword, Kevin Roberts writes that Congress is the most powerful branch, the most accountable branch to the people. And then he calls them out for what he calls, I love this term, preening cowardice in giving over authority to the executive branch. And I'm with him, okay, to this point. But then when I think about Project 2025 as a whole, it sounds like, well, if the goal of Project 2025, at least in part, is to give much more authority to the executive, it seems to me that enhancing presidential power would just make the underlying problem of the preening cowardice of Congress even worse. So I guess I'm wondering, is there a contradiction at the heart of this whole project?
Yeah, I agree. And there are a bunch of places where I feel like the authors lay out a diagnosis that is really persuasive, and then the prescription makes me scratch my head. And that is one of them. I think he's totally right about the preening cowardice of Congress. I mean, Congress, one of the reasons we're having battles over executive power, when we look at, the Supreme Court case on Chevron, for example, the problem is that Congress has delegated so many things to the White House. They've delegated things to the executive branch. They've established laws to have bureaucrats set these things up. They have delegated, they can't pass a budget. They basically delegated the power to make war to the White House for decades now. They don't want to make tough decisions. And, they've done these things. And there are places where regulation is delicate, and it does not make sense necessarily for members of Congress to be writing the detailed regulations. But there's also places where clearly they don't want to take a tough vote, and it's much easier for them to just push it on the White House. So, I think that's right. I don't think a lot of Americans think Congress is working well. But I don't understand how taking more power for the executive branch, including not only, over independent regulatory agencies, for example, but also, the impoundment power to impound funds that Congress has appropriated. I'm not sure how this is going to solve that problem or make things any better,
I guess maybe the most charitable reading I could have of it is that if you decide that Congress is simply a lost cause, then you just focus more power on the executive, because at least there you can get something done. I don't know.
I mean, I think that's right. I think that is the attitude they have. I think they're probably right about policy outcomes. But there, I think you get into a constitutional issue of checks and balances that, upsets the system as it has more or less functioned for a long time.
Yeah, and certainly I think we're seeing a lot of that now, because if you take a look at the Trump administration in this first 100 whatever days, in terms of executive action, all kinds of stuff going on, but in terms of legislative accomplishments, almost nothing at all. But then again, when you look at some of these executive actions, it seems like they might be set up to get shot down by the very conservatives on the court who were shooting down liberal things under stuff like, the major questions doctrine or that sort of thing that conservatives were cheering for. I have a sense that the cheering is going to be a lot more muted if that comes to pass.
Right. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when conservatives were very upset about Obama saying he had a pen and phone and was going to use executive orders over a Republican Congress. It's interesting. There's not the same kind of hostility towards courts in Project 2025 that you see emanating from the White House. And I think part of that is there is a faith in the document that if they can get the right test cases before the Supreme Court, they're going to get favorable rulings. And that includes on things like independent agencies. I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, it's possible, but we've seen the Supreme Court go both ways on some of these questions. And I don't think that it is, outside of maybe Alito and Thomas, quite as favorable terrain as the authors think. And I'm curious to see what happens if they do start getting shut down by the court.
Yeah, I'm more than a little bit curious about that myself. Another thing that occurs to me is that for a long, long time now, Donald Trump has just railed against how the justice system's weaponized against him by his enemies who have Trump derangement syndrome and all that. But yet it seems like Project 2025, in a sense, calls for even more of that sort of thing, giving the executive more control over these levers of power. And I'm wondering, how does Project 2025 or can it sort of reconcile these grievances against, if Donald Trump's right and the justice system was weaponized by a previous administration, are we just assuming that philosopher king Donald Trump would not do that? Or you see what I'm saying here?
You're right. And I think there are places where they complain, sometimes rightfully, sometimes more tenuously, about politicization. But their answer is more politicization. It's simply like politicizing the other direction. And you see that in a lot of places. I mean, the Justice Department is a great example. And here again, there's a sort of intellectually coherent case. Like the Justice Department is weird. Here you have this department that is led by the Attorney General, who is a political appointee, serving at the will of the president. And yet we also expect the Justice Department to act in this semi-independent way, to not be interfered with by the White House, to not, undertake political prosecutions, blah, blah, blah. And that's a tricky balance. We've seen different attorneys general try that balance and succeed better than others. And what the authors of Project 2025 say is, well, that's ridiculous. It's part of the executive branch. It needs to be responsive to the executive branch. So I think, this serves a little bit of a dual purpose. They get a more consistent view of the executive branch that they like. And Trump gets the opportunity to interfere with the Justice Department, use it for retribution, so on and so forth. So already we see, for example, Trump firing line prosecutors in the Justice Department. We see the Justice Department undertaking these very politically tinged investigations. So, I think this is an example of symbiosis. They have different reasons for advocating for these things, Trump and the Project 25 authors, but they have a shared interest in the outcome.
Title IX comes up more than a few times in the document. Can you talk a little bit about what you perceive as what the Project 2025 folks see as incorrect, I guess I'll put it, with how Democrats have understood Title IX and how their views of it differ, how they hope to use it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you get a lot is this idea of gender ideology. Or gender science. There's a couple of different terms they use, but the sense there is, in reality, there are two sexes, male and female. But the left has undertaken this ideological project of convincing people that they're fluid, or that you can be non-binary, or that you can move between them, and that is a perversion. So we need to go back behind that, and they want to use Title IX, to reinterpret Title IX basically to push the vision they want, which would be two sexes. They want to define sex as male and female. And we saw Trump, issue an executive order along those lines. and generally push Title IX as a tool for those. We see Trump also using Title IX, for example, when he's concerned about transports. So there's a sense that some of these tools that the left has used to push their ideology can be also effective tools for the right. And it's not just on Title IX, I'd say. Like, there's also, the idea that the Justice Department Civil Rights Division has been too focused on, racially disparate impact of voting laws. It needs to instead focus on things like anti-Christian discrimination or anti-white discrimination. So here's where they want to, instead of pulling back these agencies in a way that some Republicans have done in the past, they more want to switch. They want to sort of turn them 180 degrees.
On the issue of climate, there's a part of the Project 2025 I read that said the Biden administration's climate fanaticism will need a whole of government unwinding. Now, I read that and I felt like, okay, I was reasonably okay with what the Biden administration did on climate, but there was no actual Green New Deal. It didn't even feel like it went as far as people slightly further to the left than me wanted. And so I guess I'm struggling to understand what they see as so fanatical about Biden-era views of climate, or if it's just sort of puffery, I guess, in that document, and what sort of environmental changes they are proposing. Is there anything other than just, well, we shouldn't have environmental regulations, or what?
It's really sweeping in a lot of ways. I was struck by the energy stuff. Unlike Trump, they don't call it a hoax. But they do go right up to that. I mean, there's a sense that, I guess I'd say there's a bunch of ways they want to dismantle regulation. They want to get rid of a lot of climate regulations. They don't want to be regulating greenhouse gases. They want to step back research on climate. And that involves a whole range of kinds of research, even things like what NOAA is doing to research climate. They think those things should be eliminated. They want to privatize NOAA to a great extent. Even things like weather forecasts they think should be in the private sector or should be only available to private companies. They want to pull back non-climate related regulations on pollution. They tell this kind of triumphal story, which is back in the 70s, the air was bad, the rivers were burning. We implemented, we created the EPA. It solved a lot of those problems. But now environmentalists are pursuing these much vaguer goals. They think the climate is warming, but they can't point out how much of this actually comes from people. We need to stop chasing after these things. And we need to just rely on sort of private industry innovation to solve climate. And we also need to unleash industry. So, for example, they see the Interior Department as being more than anything a department that should be allowing oil and gas exploitation, opening up government land to do that, encouraging drilling, doing everything it can to get fossil fuels out of the ground.
And when you pull back and take a look at Project 2025, the policy prescriptions as a whole, what do you see as the things that are most potentially damaging, either in the short term or in the long term, because they could be very different sort of things, not just considering what they are, but also things that have a greater or lesser chance of being implemented. Because there are some things that aren't going to happen for sure. But
right, we're not going to eliminate the Fed, for example. Exactly. It's not happening anytime soon.
Yeah,
yeah. It's such a good question, and it's tricky because of the vast range. I mean, the things from the big structural reforms I suggest to just very specific policies. I think on a human level, we're going to see a lot of impact. We're going to see it we're going to see it harder for people to obtain government services. We're going to see, by virtue of getting rid of and attacking a lot of the diversity initiatives, we're going to see racial outcomes on a number of things diverge. We are seeing trans people pushed into the margins, pushed into the shadows. So these things are happening already. And those affect people on an individual level, although not society in the same way. I also think that the changes to government are going to be permanent. They're really big, and they're not going to be something that can snap back. I think we're used to a politics where there's a new administration of a new party and things switch back. Every new EPA, for example, makes new rules. So a Republican EPA will loosen rules, and then a Democratic EPA will strengthen them. But that's not really what I think we're going to see. Once you start laying off tens or hundreds of thousands of civil servants, it's going to be very hard to build any of those things back. You're not going to rebuild whole research centers. You're not going to get the expertise back in. And so you're going to see a federal government that just looks very different and is going to look that way for a long time. And I think that's going to change the way we interact with the government on an individual level all over the place.
I guess.
And then finally, if the executive branch is much more powerful, I think there's a danger of checks and balances. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to me, it seems like one of the things that you hit on there that concerns me so much is what I'd call, I guess, the brain drain. And that I'm already hearing reports that if you walk through certain halls in certain DC office buildings, they seem kind of much more quiet. And I think back to the mid 1990s when Congress experienced its own brain drain because they basically defunded a lot of the support agencies and that sort of thing. And so I think, well, this is just an opportunity for lobbyists and corporate interests to kind of get in there and have even more influence. And my God, that's just the opposite of what I would want.
That's a great point. I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. Like there's a greater reliance on lobbyists and outside groups in Congress. And you can imagine the whole federal government working in that way. I mean, in addition to there's a lot of research that I think will not get done if the federal government is not either doing it or funding it, which is what the administration seems to want.
And I worry it's weird. In a strange way, it reminds me of the old Soviet Union, like under, say, Stalin, when they talked about, good Soviet research or science or something like that. And I hear this echoes of that thing, sometimes really clear echoes of that from the right saying that, yeah, we're not going to do these things because we start from our ideological conclusions, and any science that doesn't happen to align with that, well, we are either going to denounce or not fund in the first place. And so that's a big concern of mine.
Yeah, it's very hard to figure out where you draw a line on what's ideological and what's not. And, there have been these instances in the first 3 months or so of the administration where programs have been shut down. And then what you see is top administration officials saying, this is malicious compliance. This is somebody trying to embarrass us by shutting these things down. And who knows? Maybe there are instances of that. But I think part of the problem is it's very hard to tell what passes muster and what doesn't. And so people are going to be scared. You also have like a push in Project 2025 for, there's multiple places where they're calling for research, but they're calling for research like, we want to do research on the ill effects of abortion on women. There may be research to be done there, but you've already said what you want your outcome to be. You're starting from a pretty ideological point of view.
One of the things that surprised me about the Trump administration, so many things, but one of them is how often we're talking about a term that we don't talk about too much, and that's impoundment. And in the book, you write that it is a dry name, but a huge potential impact. So can you talk a little bit about what impoundment is and how it fits into the larger structure of Project 2025?
Yeah, in briefest form, impoundment is the executive branch not spending money that Congress has allocated. So, Congress has the power of the purse. We all know this. But what some of these folks believe is that the president should be able to hold back funds for whatever reason. So that basically Congress is setting a ceiling, but not a floor. Presidents for a long time did do some impoundment and had clashes with Congress over it. And this reached a head in the 70s under Nixon when Congress finally got frustrated and passed a law that said the president can impound. He can occasionally make requests, but he has to come to Congress and get permission for a specific thing. And the sense among people in the Project 2025 orbit is that that is unconstitutional. They see that as a violation of the president's power. And Trump trying to do some impoundment in his first term. In fact, in his first impeachment, he was trying to impound funds that Congress had allocated for Ukraine. And, I think that became a question of abuse of power and Trump using the case for his own political gain. But it was an impoundment case as well. Here again, they think that if they can challenge the case, they can get it to the Supreme Court and they will get the law overturned and they'll have the right to impound. We saw a brief attempt at this, and I think the first 2 weeks of the administration, it's a little bit of a blur now, but it was very early. They said they were freezing a lot of grants, and they got a lot of pushback from Republican senators and had to unfreeze them. But I don't think that's the last we'll hear of it.
So to this point, as best as we can tell, how much of Project 2025 has actually been implemented, and how much more can President Trump do without Congress assisting him, and which is going to be a pretty heavy lift, I would expect, especially given his narrow margins in the House?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been hard for me to kind of quantify it. You can draw a straight line from a lot of proposals in Project 2025 to the executive orders we've seen. So there's a lot of individual things. And there are a couple good websites that have been tracking this that people can use to see the specific lineup. But I think it also doesn't totally convey the totality because we're looking at these more systemic changes. They have laid off a lot of civil servants. I think that will be hard to put back for the brain drain reasons you were saying. I do think that there's a limit to how far they can get. They're going to, if they want to close the education department, which is both a goal of Project 2025 and a goal that Trump has laid out, it's going to be very hard for them to do that without Congress's help. And it seems hard to imagine Congress doing that. I think they've gotten as far as they can, partly because Republicans in Congress are so closely aligned with Trump and unwilling to challenge him. There's a lot of places where Congress could have sort of reclaimed more power already and has refused to do it. But as the politics shift or as Trump gets less popular, I think it will be challenging for them. The authors of Project 2025 understood that dynamic, basically. I mean, they say, the first 100 days are crucial. The first 2 years are crucial. The 4 years are crucial. They know they have to get as far as they can before political pushback starts. But they're also planning for a much longer future, well past when Trump is in office. So they want to simply get as far as they can, as fast as they can, change the baseline and then work from there for the next phase.
There are obviously the true believers who read this and be like, yeah, we should do this, including folks in Congress. But I wonder if maybe a more common attitude, especially even among Republicans in Congress, is to think, well, you know what? A lot of this stuff is not good. And it also could come back and bite us when there's going to be a future Democratic president. So maybe I'll just sort of sit back and not do anything and hope the courts invalidate as much of this as possible. Do you get a sense of that at all? Do you feel like a common view among non-MAGA Republicans, especially in Washington?
I think that is right. I mean, it gets back to the cowardice that they diagnosed and that we were talking about a little bit ago. There's an unwillingness to stand up for kind of congressional prerogatives. It's interesting because Republicans have repeatedly done this with Trump, sort of non-Trump Republicans. They keep thinking that he will burn himself out. They thought he would burn himself out in the 2016 primary. They thought he would lose the general election. They thought they could kind of control him in the first presidency. They thought after January 6th that he was dead in the water. They thought in November 2022 that he wouldn't enter the race. And if he did, he was going to lose to Ron DeSantis. So it keeps happening. And they keep having this hope. But, it's true that a lot of these ideas are very unpopular. I think people, voted for Trump based on the economy, and they voted for him in some cases based on this sense that they wanted a restoration. But what that restoration actually looks like in practice, I think, is not going to be as popular. So I think some of these things will be put back. But it's hard, we've seen a long, slow shift towards executive power. We have not seen a serious pendulum shift backwards. It's hard to imagine what it looks like for Congress to reclaim a lot of power. And it's also hard to imagine how you put back some of these executive structures in the federal government once they've been demolished.
So when you go to your dark place and you look at all this, and honestly, after reading 900 plus pages of this, you had to have been in sort of a dark place. So what's your kind of worst case scenario coming out of all of this? And then we'll kind of go back to something more optimistic to close.
I mean, I think there's a real danger of a very authoritarian government. If you build to a system where the president has so much power and doesn't have checks and balances, they can do anything. And you may like what the president does or you may not, but it doesn't matter. And I think it's hard to maintain a democracy without that. I have critiques of the Constitution and of the American system. There are certainly periods in our history when it has worked better or worse. But, I think generally I think of myself as a very patriotic person. I think that this is a really effective and resilient system of government. And I worry about it slipping away from us.
And it's hard for me to imagine any future president, even a Democrat, looking at any of the things that might have happened in terms of executive power and saying, well, no, that was too much. Let's rescind some executive power. And so whether it's more right wing or left wing authoritarianism in the executive, it seems like if we follow the Project 2025 blueprint, we're going to get more of it either way.
Yeah, exactly. You see lots of Democrats running for office criticizing Republican excesses. You saw Barack Obama running, criticizing civil liberties violations in the war on terror. And then you saw President Barack Obama taking advantage of those things and sometimes expanding them. Presidents like executive power, and for good reason. They ran for office because they want to get things done. And the more easily they can get that done, the happier they're going to be.
And so let's try to close on a positive note, as positive as we can be. So
we'll try.
Yeah, well, it can be tough, but when you kind of look at the landscape and see how Project 2025 is going and so forth and responses to it, what, if anything, makes you feel even somewhat optimistic about, say, the near-term future, the next 2 to 4 years or so? And I don't want to go out further because anyone can make predictions past that. I think it's just basically making stuff up.
I think you make a good point that some of these things are going to get blocked. Some of these things are going to get rescinded. And so I think, there are things that are within executive power and those are going to stand, and the things that are not may not stand. I also think that there is a growing awareness about these things. And you can even imagine, look, people take the system for granted. They take the things that have made our government strong and stable for granted. And if this wakes people up to that and, gives them a better sense of what we need to build in the government, what we need to not take for granted, and how we can structure a government in a way that is stable and fair and also effective, that would be a positive lesson to come out of all of this.
All right. Well, on that note, we will close. I should mention that the book, The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America, is a lot shorter and far more interesting to read than the actual Mandate for Leadership. So I would encourage folks to check it out. I learned a lot, and I'm convinced that other folks will too as well. And David Graham, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email at politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,